Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's tuning in, and Ramadan Mubarak. My name is Isra Ibrahim, and I will be your moderator today for today's program. I am also the media analyst and researcher with Milestones. So today's roundtable is titled Malcolm X Then and Now. And this conversation, I say, was inspired by the fact that we want to discuss the legacy of Malcolm X, but we also want to discuss how he is relevant in anti-American struggles and within our own works that we're currently doing now. And I think it's fair to say that all the panelists here, we kind of share similar criticisms of the larger American Muslim sphere. And by recognizing that, we wanted to also put emphasis on the fact of we want to unite within the struggle as well. So joining us today for this roundtable, we have members of Milestone, but also a member of the Black Dharma Network, a member of the Oakland Islamic Community Center, and a member of the Jamaat of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio. So thank you to our panelists. I'm going to introduce them now. So for our first panelist, we have our very own Tanzeen Doha, who is the general editor for Milestone. He's an anthropologist Islam and organizer against the war on terror. We also have Hannibal Abdul Shakur, who is a community organizer, a former member of the Oakland Cop Watch, and a special contributor and researcher for Milestone. So thank you for being here today with us as well. Also, we have Imad Defropoulos, who is the Amir of the Northern California Jamaat of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio. Thank you for being here with us today. And we also have Abdul Malik Ali, who is the Amir of the Oakland Islamic Community Center. And last but not least, we have Hakeem Muhammad, who is the founder of the Black Dharma Network, which promotes Islamic values within inner city Black communities. He is also a public interest law scholar, and he has helped police departments with litigation to be held accountable for police brutality against Black men. So thank you guys, Jazakallah khair, for being here with us today. Awesome. So to begin discussing more about Malcolm X's relevance within our own work, I'd like to pose a question to Hakeem Muhammad. How does the mission of Malcolm X influence the agenda of the Black Dharma Network?
So thank you, sister, for having me on. Thank you, brother Tanzeen, and to all the wonderful commentators on Milestones. So Malcolm X, in the last interview of his life, he said that the most fertile areas for Islam in the West is Black American communities. And he said that the Muslim world needed to recognize that the most fertile areas for Islam in the West are Black American communities. And in one of his early speeches, he raised a rhetorical question asking, why is the American white man so afraid of American Negroes learning about Islam? And he answered this by saying that Islam is a religion that motivates the morals of a people who want to do right, and that by learning about Islam, hundreds of thousands of American Negroes are turning away from drugs, from crimes, from vices, and other social ills that the American white social system sets up for Black communities in the hood. And so Malcolm X, he recognized the power of Islam to transform Black communities, particularly within the inner city. And when you read the last interview of his life with Saeed Ramadan, he outlines an agenda of what he wanted to do moving forward. And so Malcolm X, he stated that he wanted to correct misinformation that he had previously taught about Islam, and that he wanted to introduce to Black communities authentic information about Islam. He said he wanted to set up various Islamic centers so that Black people, particularly those within desolated inner cities, can learn and can gain access to information about Islam. And so this mission, unfortunately, this mission of Malcolm X, it was unfortunately not finished, as we know that our brother was martyred. And so the Black Dharma Network, inspired by this mission and wanting to continue it. We were founded to promote Islamic values and virtues within inner city Black communities. The African-American legal scholar, Derek Bell, he said that the Black inner city, that is the American equivalent to homelands within South Africa, where poverty and despair has driven many to drug addictions, to lives of crimes. And Malcolm X himself, he in parts of his autobiographies, he's talking about some of his friends in the hood who he's saying that they have the potential to be great engineers, great scientists, great mathematicians, but that instead that they were victims of the American white man's social system. And further, Malcolm X says in his autobiography that it was Islam that empowered him not to just be a dead criminal in a grave or someone who's just serving time within the penitentiary, that the religion of Islam had completely transformed his life. In fact, he reflects upon this story in his autobiography, the Greek story of Icarus, who had his father make him various wings. And in this Greek story that Malcolm X invokes, he says that Icarus had these wings that his father told him never to fly too close to the sun. But in disobedience to his father's instructions, he flew close to that sun and his wings began to fail. And Malcolm X reflects upon this story saying, whatever wings that he has, that those wings, those metaphorical wings, it came from the religion of Islam. And so we believe that the power of Islam to give our people these metaphorical wings that will enable our people to overcome various traps that white supremacy sets up for Black brothers and sisters in the hood, from the drugs, from the gangs, etc. And so we want to introduce to our people proper knowledge of Tawheed, accepting the oneness of God, the Prophet Muhammad, the finality of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so that's how Malcolm X's mission influences the work of Black Dharma Network.
No, thank you so much for that answer. I want to go to Imad, also kind of a similar question. How are Malcolm's life and teachings relevant to the Jamaat of Sheikh Osman Danfodio?
Okay, so we're starting with the last question first, alhamdulillah. I think there's a saying, وَأَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. To continue, I think there's a saying or something that Shaykh Uthman Danfodio said about his teacher, Jibril ibn Umar, and he said, I'm just a wave from the waves of Sheikh Jibril. And I think that the Jamaat of the Shehu, and we're not exceptional in this, is in many ways just a wave from the waves that that Sheikh Malcolm made. And anybody though that really is doing anything about Haq in North America, if they wouldn't say the same, I would look at them extremely suspect. Like how can you claim that you're something other than that? Really, if you're really, worth the time. I think that it's hard to tackle. After I wrote, after the discussion questions, I put them yesterday when I was like actually trying to hammer out exactly what I was going to say. I was like, oh man, you chose some really broad questions. So there's so much to say, but I mean, I think one of the first things I would say is there's a tradition of Black excellence that Sheikh Malcolm epitomizes. And that tradition goes all the way back before him, all the way back to West Africa, and it goes all the way back through our spiritual and genetic ancestors, all the way to the the generations of the Salaf, the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. One of the aspects of Black excellence that we emphasize in the Jamaat is, acting on corroborated knowledge. Sheikh Malcolm didn't act on anything but corroborated knowledge. He was all facts. I was watching this interview with his sister Ella Collins yesterday, which is extremely moving. I hadn't seen it before. I guess I was sleeping. And that's one of the things she said was that he said, especially after, in general, but especially after he went to prison and this is something she tried to cultivate in him. He had a all facts realism. He had a realistic approach to life. He wasn't concerned with anything dramatic. He wasn't concerned with anything sensational. She said he was formulating his life view strictly on the realities, that were in front of him, not running away from them, facing them, and then making, his, an analysis and a perspective on the world based on that reality, and not based on anything else, not based on fairy tales, not based on what's nice, not based on what makes him feel good, what makes us feel good as Black people, what makes us feel good as Muslims, or anything else, but based on reality and facts. And so I think that I see that the tradition of acting on corroborated knowledge, the tradition of acting only on what we can verify for facts with literature, with chains of transmission of knowledge, that in West Africa, there were people who, were extremely rigorous and excelled above even others in the Islamic world in terms of how meticulous they were with knowledge. That when they would learn something, when they would learn the Quran, when they would, it wasn't enough to just memorize the Quran. That was basic. Children were memorizing the Quran. When you went into your higher education, there were slaves in North America who were reproducing whole texts of jurisprudence, the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd specifically, just from memory, which isn't rhymed or metered. Anyone has done any memorization at all of Quran and then has done any memorization of a text that doesn't rhyme and the Quran doesn't necessarily rhyme, but doesn't have a meter or a flow like that. It's just a straight text. At least for me, it's way harder, and these books are like this. And that's something that I think that our Sheikh Muhammad Sharif was extremely inspired by, and that we try to take, even an inkling of what Sheikh Malcolm had in that respect. I think also, I heard my own voice back. Also, there's a sunnah of Jamaat itself. I mean, Jamaat is the Umar bin al-Khattab anhu actually said there's no. He said there is no Jamaat without Umara, without amirs or amirship, and there is no Islam without Jamaat. Which is a power, what are you going to add to that statement? And Sheikh Malcolm had the type of personality where he easily could have just been a personality. He didn't need to have organization around him. He could have just said, I'm just me, I just stand on my own, and people would have followed him. He could have had any kind of cult of personality he wanted. He could have picked from a straight religious cult. He could have had, a Nation of Islam type organization. He could have gone in a spiritual direction and just been a spiritual icon and leader. He could have gone in a political direction, but he didn't do that. He always made it. He was always building organizations, and he didn't make those organizations about himself, even though they often were about people following him. But his emphasis was always on structure. It was always on organization, not on personality. And something that we have nowadays that our Jamaat is very critical of, and we are trying to stay away from, and may Allah guide us and help us, in that, is that what we have nowadays is people think that figureheads are leaders, and they're not, and they think that celebrities are sheikhs. There's been this taking of the concept of tasawwuf and removing it from this tradition of excellence and removing it from this tradition of facts, literature, and structure and jama'ah, and being very structured things, and making it about, well, this certain personality is beloved and he's popular, and so this makes him some kind of a sheikh or an authority. This is the opposite of what Sheikh Malcolm did. Sheikh Malcolm, and he could have, we know with the charisma that he had, right? We know with how much he's loved, it would have been easy for him to just be on what my uncles called the Muslim show.
I think that's the point you're making, how Malcolm X specifically focused on, creating this organizational model for us to follow. And I think with that point, Amir Abdul Malik, if you could speak about how Malcolm X followed the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's model of organization and organizing.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله Yeah, Malcolm, as was said earlier, was definitely an organizer. But this was a man who followed the prophetic tradition, and there's an attempt to try to separate him from his spiritual base, from his spiritual foundation. Malcolm wanted to see the liberation of his people, of course, and as was stated earlier, he also wanted to see the establishment of Islam. Right. So when Malcolm dealt with the liberation of his people, it was coming from an Islamic mindset. Right. Um, um, First and foremost, of course, when Malcolm made his Hajj to Mecca, uh, I think one of the most serious transitions he went through was going from shirk to tawheed. That was critical. And shirk to tawheed, I think, was everything. And then when you look at Malcolm, when he focused on the international, when he focuses on unity, right? When he focuses on the self-determination, right? Black self-determination, right? This is coming from an Islamic mindset, right? This is the year 1441 for us. 1,441 years ago, we established our first city-state. So self-determination for Muslims is extremely, extremely critical. Malcolm was talking about Black self-determination, his emphasis on moral character. See, all this is the prophetic model. The emphasis on moral character, education, family stability. And then the other thing with Malcolm that showed his allegiance, if you will, to the prophetic model was that he focused on the youth. He focused on the youth, and he encouraged the youth to get involved, right? To get involved, to rely on their own skills and make their mistakes. You know, wisdom comes from making mistakes, right? And so one of the places wisdom comes from. And so he encouraged the youth. And so all these things was based on the prophetic model. And the prophet, peace be upon him, you check out his seerah, of course, you know, he went through a process of organization, right? First, he would focus on the individual, right? He's focusing on the individual, 13 years in Mecca. He's focusing on the individual. Then he gets to a point in time where there's the establishment of institutions, right? Like in Medina, right? Now you're establishing institutions and so on and so forth. So Malcolm was dealing with all of that. And I want to end by saying this. There's three things here. One, the process of taskil bin nafs, working on our moral character, right? The Prophet, peace be upon him, said that is the most important jihad. He didn't say it was the highest, but he said it was the most important of the jihad. And then the second phase is commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, right? As well as the dawah, right? And so, and then the third phase is establishing institutions. So all these things are done actually simultaneously. So if you look where Malcolm was coming from, he was in all those areas. Taskil bin nafs, you know, the moral character component. He was commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. And he was also doing dawah. And then he was also focused on building institutions, right? Institutions that would help establish Islam, and institutions that would help in the liberation of our people, right? And so all of that is rooted in the Quran, is rooted in the Sunnah, and rooted in the Seerah.
Well, thank you so much, Amir Abdulmalik, for that. Hannibal, if you could just, because we've been speaking about Malcolm's evolution, if you could just speak to the importance of why it's important to understand the stages of consciousness that he kind of evolved through.
For me, this is, you know, it can be overstated. The examples that we can draw from the various stages of development that Malcolm X went through. I mean, personally, I was familiar with Malcolm X as a child because in my home, that was the kind of reading that was going on. I wasn't reading his autobiography, but I saw it. And I remember images of his face and his autobiography, you know. And if we can even start there, as a child, Malcolm was brought up initially in a home with a father who was a very outspoken monotheist preacher, and he was a very outspoken political organizer of the Garvey movement. And so even from the very beginning of his life, we can see those themes that he came to embody later on. We can see that they were like established in his home by his father. And so, that's very important to understand, because, sometimes we might miss the value of that, of establishing certain things within our children and establishing certain values very early on from the beginning, and having those role models. So at a very early age, as a small child, he had a role model of dignity, responsibility, courage, strength, and that's very important for him as how he imagined himself, from a child on, so that's a very important thing to understand. And then looking as his life progressed, his father was essentially beat to death, likely by the Ku Klux Klan, for organizing, for trying to uplift Black people in America. His house was burned down, and even if we look at those two things again, we're seeing, early in his life, those things which would really come to a dramatic head in his adulthood, but these things were establishing for him who he was, who is his identity, and how he understood his place in this world, in this nation, in this society, etc. Looking at his father and seeing the example his father set and what was then done to his father, and that's all worthy of note. And then the way that his mother was preyed upon by the social services, and later on institutionalized, breaking up his family and putting him and his siblings into the system. This is very important to understand too, because when we look at his critical perspective on liberals and assumed good intentions of certain institutions, we know that those institutions wrecked his family and wrecked his life, and so he very early on was and I would say blessed, even though this was a hardship, he was blessed to be given clarity and a clear understanding of what he was dealing with, and as his life progressed, we see that later on he ended up in the streets, involved with that criminal life and that underworld life, or some will call it lumpen, or there's different ways that people characterize it, but he became involved in that life. He was considered a pimp by some. He was a drug addict. He was involved with organized crime, running numbers, etc. And these are all very detestable things. These are all things that really break down and corrupt the people and weaken the people at the level of social fabric. That led him back into the system in prison, etc. Right? And I'm gonna cut myself short here because I don't want to go on forever about his life. These are things that people should know, and if they don't know, they can't find out from his autobiography, inshallah. But the reason I wanted to point out these things is because for all of us in the Black community, and even people outside of the community, these are all stages. All of these stages and experiences really capture and encapsulate almost the whole breadth of our experience as Black people in America. What either happened to him, his father, his mother, his siblings, these are all of the various problems that we're up against. And these are all of the various things that have to be addressed. The various stages of consciousness that he went through, and all of those things represent the things we have to deal with. They represent the obstacles laid before us, and they represent sort of, the wide variety of demographics of Black people who really benefited from his life and benefited from his sacrifices and his courage, so I'm gonna cut myself short there.
Thank you so much, Hannibal, for that. I just want to remind the viewers, if you guys have any specific questions, again, just leave a comment below and we'll get to them, inshallah. So yeah, I think we've been speaking a lot about, I guess, Malcolm's own personal evolution, his political relevance to Black communities in America. But I think specifically for Tanzine, as an anthropologist and political organizer of Islamism, how do you see Malcolm X's position within the larger history of Islamism? Because I think that's a facet of Malcolm X that isn't really discussed at all. It's kind of just limited to, more, liberal, Black radical spheres and whatnot. But I think that's a very important point we should kind of discuss on.
Thanks for the question. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum to everybody who's here. I'm really excited for this panel, particularly because our new guests, Brother Hakeem and Imad, are here. This is a really important panel. The question is really significant to me. As a researcher, when I was looking at the history of what is sometimes called political Islam, as if Islam could be separated, theologically, etc. But anyway, in the academy, there are studies of political Islam, and most of the Islamist history that is kind of considered as Islamist is quite specific about colonialism, but it doesn't actually talk about modern slavery. So most of the articulations of what is Islamism is actually understood as a kind of struggle against colonial processes and colonial structure and so on. What I find fascinating about Malcolm, and I'll give you an example. I was in Bangladesh in my field work, and that's my country, so I go there all the time. I talk to a lot of people. And there were conversations and people were very curious about Malcolm X. Internationally, Muhammad Ali, as a child, I was more aware of Muhammad Ali as a child growing up in a different country. He was more global phenomenon. He was a boxer, fighting and so on, everybody's role model. And especially little boys, they looked up to Muhammad Ali as a major figure. He actually went to Bangladesh a long time ago, decades ago. So Malcolm's history would be discovered later by very politicized circles. And in some of those conversations, I actually met politicized ulama who would ask me about how to now translate Malcolm's biography into Bengali. There are conversations that are happening with me. And one of the things I've realized is that much of how Islamism is conceptualized, unfortunately, and how Malcolm is understood is most of the time, even though we talk about internationalism, the conversation remains within America. And that's fine. There's a specificity to that. But I think one of the ways that Islamism has to reconfigure itself is to understand how there is a long legacy of Islamist struggle against slave plantations. And Malcolm X was the sort of like the ultimate figure that kind of brings up all of that entire genealogy of struggle. And so Islamism has to be understood as also an anti-slavery struggle. And so once we understand that, because there are, social scientifically, there's a difference between colonialism and slavery. And many of the Muslims are not clear about these things because we tend to use words which are fine, like oppression, but sometimes that could be vague because oppression, what kind, right? So when we're thinking about slavery as a specific model of oppression, of subjugation, we're thinking about colonialism as a model of servitude. We're thinking about capitalism as a model that is about exploitation of labor. So these are different forms, right? So Islamic struggle has to be conceptualized in terms of its understanding of antagonism that was in America, and how world history is often, when we look at colonialism, is understood through the history of Europe. But when we look at slavery, it needs to be understood through the history of America. And so Malcolm allows us as a figure how to think about Islamic struggle in which world history is organized around policies of America and the American project. And this is why I was always very critical of American Muslims, the types who use Malcolm's name to kind of promote an integrationist model, which is not just a problem in terms of how Malcolm X thought about America, but it's entirely wrong about how Islamism would understand America in relation to struggle, right? So if we understand what chattel slavery was all about, it was actually the ultimate form of forced shirk, on people. And if we understand that people are forced to worship a man through slavery, there's nothing more criminal in Islamic theology than that. So that is like the greatest of the oppressors. There's nothing more criminal than forcing someone to obey you. And they want to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is the legacy of Malcolm. That's why Malcolm is ontologically a figure against the American project. It's not a choice. We don't have an option. We can't read this way and that way. It's not a choice. It's an ontological position that Islam articulates for Malcolm, that that's not allowed. In the Sharia, that's not allowed. So this is very important for us to understand, to grasp America at the level of its ontology, and then criticize it. And that's where Malcolm becomes a really important figure, and he makes Islamism globally a very significant shift, because now Islam is, if you look at our Milestones article, one of the articles that a young brother wrote from back home is he right away now, after we wrote the Fox and Wolf article, he sent us a piece in which he's talking about the American police as similar to the American military. Now there's a connection. We're understanding these links between the structures of neo-slavery and the structures of neocolonialism. And now we understand as Islamists, what are the different dimensions of our struggle? And Malcolm really is a visionary and allows us to understand that model.
Thank you so much for Tanzeen. I think just personally, just like for myself as well, that distinction and just kind of understanding how Islam and Blackness have this like ontological consensus that they're kind of anti-American and anti-slavery has been like very, very helpful. So thank you for that. I want to ask Hakeem, can you speak, I guess, going off of what Tanzeen's point, the political relevance that Malcolm X has on the Muslim community?
So Brother Tanzeen brought up a variety of excellent points that I just want to elaborate further upon in answering this question. So when we're speaking about the antagonism between Islam and white supremacy, I think it needs to be recognized that white supremacy and slavery, that this was a war upon Islam and Islamic practices. For example, in the Bahia slave rebellion, there were members of the community of Uthman Dan Fodio who were forced into slave ships and forced to America against their will, where they were forced and compelled to worship a white image of Jesus. They were forced to cease their Islamic practices. And in fact, many of them in the Bahia slave rebellion, they fought against these practices, and they felt that it was their Islamic obligation to fight against these practices. There were enslaved Africans such as Lucatin, who was the mastermind of the Islamic slave revolt in Brazil. And when he was put on trial for his role in sparking this slave rebellion, and they asked him during trial, "What's your name?" He said, "My name is Bilal," in commemoration, showing the inspiration that even the Sahaba of Bilal ibn Rabah, may Allah be pleased with him, had in terms of being an influence upon these slave rebels. When you look at in the United States, there was Omar ibn Said, who actually, he wanted to make salat on the slave plantation, and his slave master didn't allow him to do that. His slave master persecuted him for doing that, and he actually had to flee, and he fled just to make salat, and they eventually ended up recapturing him. When you look at Phyllis Wheatley, she's renowned for, she's known as the first African-American poet, the first great African-American literary author. What many don't know about Phyllis Wheatley, because if you look at her writing, she's promoting Christianity. She's thanking the white slave masters for taking her from Africa and making her Christian. Scholars have looked into Phyllis Wheatley's early life and actually discovered that she was originally a Muslim, and that her language acquisition skills were developed as a result of Quranic schools in West Africa, and that in her early childhood, she was writing Arabic on the walls, Arabic text on the walls. And this is why she even developed she developed the language acquisition skills to learn English and to even learn aspects of Latin, but she was forcibly converted to Christianity. And so this is a crime in Islam, and this is something that any Muslim would be concerned about, should be cognizant of white supremacy and its role upon the wreaking havoc upon Islamic civilizations in West Africa, wreaking havoc upon enslaved African Muslims who wanted to practice their deen in its totality, that this is a crime by Islamic standards. Now, coming back to the political relevance of Malcolm X, number one, Malcolm X, he recognized that white supremacy is a global political system. Malcolm X, if you listen to a speech at Oxford, he said that the American political system is built upon the castration of Black men. Furthermore, Malcolm X, he critiqued the inability of civil rights legislation to actually do away with structural racism within the United States. And this is why, and he actually gives a genealogy saying the same problem that they were dealing with in the 60s, they were dealing with in the 50s. And he was very pessimistic about the ability of civil rights legislation to change these realities, but he was confident in his ability and the ability of Islam to change the reality of Black communities in the United States. And this is why when you listen to some of Malcolm X's speeches, his speech at Oxford, he also gave a speech where he was God's judgment of white America, some of his early speeches where he critiques the inability of the legal system in America to actually resolve structural racism. And this had a profound impact on African-American legal scholars. This is why Black intellectuals, even atheists like Ta-Nehisi, he says that Malcolm X is pretty much the pioneer of critical race theory, that critical race theory was a restatement of the Black power politics of Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is one of his greatest political relevancies to the Muslim community is understanding white supremacy and white supremacy's antagonism with Islam and Muslims.
Thank you so much, Hakeem, for that. I want to go towards Ahmad. I think we all understand that Malcolm X, because he is so large within just a greater scope of things, that he's appropriated so often. So we see that there is this stark contrast as we see the stark contrast of Malcolm X as this huge like cultural icon, but also this kind of near abandonment of his goals of like self-determination and more of his like more political radical goals. So can you just speak towards that stark contrast and why you think that it exists?
Assalamu alaikum. I think that's a really important question because of the historical moment we're in now. We're in a moment when it's interesting. Like I don't know too in depth into it, but there's a historical moment we're in where, strangely, Black imagery, or rather not even imagery, but rhetoric of Blackness and Black cultural icons is being mobilized by the most anti-Black elements of the Muslim community to actually legitimize them. And the scary thing about this is that this is possible because of a kind of unity between, I would say there's a kind of, I was hesitating about whether to say this, but I'm just gonna say it. There's a unification going on between the Uncle Toms in our community and the Uncle Toms in the immigrant community coming together finally.
Speak up.
I don't know how, huh?
Speak up.
You can say that.
You can go all the way.
Yeah,
you can say that,
there's this unification going on. And Imam Malik and Sheikh Muhammad talks about this in a lot of his writings. Imam Malik and the Imams in general. In Islamic jurisprudence, there's a term for a person who leaves the lands of Islam and comes to the lands of disbelief, specifically for worldly dunya purposes, for wealth, for whatever reason, and is content to continue to live under the disbeliever. So their purpose there is not da'wah in order to transform the land into Islam. You know, when I was young, I would hear uncles from the Tabligh Jamaat, you know, some of them who were from immigrant backgrounds, who were South Asian, whatever, and they would say all the time, and I know Auntie Islamic Sarah Alameda, may Allah preserve her, was always going on about this still. One of the only people I know still saying it. She was like, you know, the only thing that justifies us being here is haram for us to be in these lands, except if you're doing da'wah, that's it. And that was their position. And then there's a fiqh basis for that, and you can find this in the books of fiqh. al-Mawardi, the Shehu, and others, right? With the intention that you think that dawah, you have to believe that this dawah is going to lead to establishing Islam in these lands, you know? And then in terms of we can get into debates about if and what, how much, how fast does that happen? Those are all debates. But the point is you're acting on corroborated knowledge, you're acting on some kind of dalil then. The person who's just here for worldly purposes, this person in fiqh is called a mudajjin, just like literally means someone who's been domesticated, is what it means. And this term is not from me. This term is used by Imam Malik, and this term is used in all the books of fiqh. It was used to apply to the people of Sicily when Sicily was retaken by the disbelievers. Al-Mawardi and other Maliki jurists, there's a long list of them mentioned in Bayan Wujub al-Hijra by Sheikh Uthman Danfodio. He goes through all the different scholars who discuss this issue. And they talk about this, and they say that the mudajjin isn't considered his testimony can't be taken. So he's not considered fully upright, a suspect. You know, everything that this person brings is suspect. So we have this kind of, and then Sheikh Malcolm has already broken down for us, and I won't belay. You can just go to any of his talks. He breaks down what is an Uncle Tom, what is a house Negro. Mm-hmm. And you know, one of the things he said is you know, he has that famous talk where he says, you know, he basically says it's the one who says our. When the master says I'm sick, he says we. Mm-hmm. When he says our police, he says the black man says our police. That's how you know a house Negro. Mm-hmm. House Negroes and the Mudajjin have formed a kind of alliance, and the main way that they're legitimizing themselves is through blackness. And to come to the question, and I'll try to keep it quick because I apologize for my long-windedness. Never done.
No, you're good. You're good.
I would sum it up that their strategy has been in 3 words: idolize to neutralize. Mm-hmm. It's to turn Malcolm into the same kind of empty celebrity that their leaders are, who just say things and are just very loved. And they're like, oh, he's a genius. He has all these flowery speeches and he was so smart. And they love this. They don't say articulate because that's out of style. You can't just come out and say, you're so articulate anymore. But they have long speeches that are flowery versions of this. Literally, they're on the internet. Just like, he was so smart. He read the dictionary. Right. And just idolizing him. No mention of his political content. No mention of the fact that in his last speech, just listen to the last speech from February. If somebody came in any masjid and said any of the things he said in that last speech, we're not talking about nation, we're talking about his last speech. Right. That person, the masjid authorities would drag him to the police station and beg him to be sent to Guantanamo Bay. Right. You know, he's talking about retaliation. He's saying, my hands are no longer tied. I will no longer be held back by Elijah Muhammad's Black Muslim movement. And if the Nazis and Norman Rockwell's American Nazi Party touch one of the nonviolent protesters, he's not talking about them touching Muslims. He's talking about they touch Dr. Martin's people. Right. And there will be, you know, paraphrasing closely, there will be consequences and repercussions. He's talking about retaliation now on behalf of non-Muslim oppressors.
He said there will be maximum retaliation.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Can you imagine if someone, I mean, we can't, it makes a buzz, you know, when somebody stands up in a masjid now and just says, you know, if we are attacked, we will defend ourselves. That's about it. Much revolutionism at this point. So I don't want too much longer, but I think, so what we need to do, I mean, this needs to be addressed by going back to that principle of we need to act, and we need, not only do we need to push his message, but we need to be pushing to people, how do we approach knowledge and information? Right. When we hear somebody speak, are we listening for charisma? Are we listening for good Arabic? What are we listening for? Are we listening for facts? Are we listening for sanad, for chains of transmission, and not just a bunch of Arabic names going back to some extreme esoteric metaphysical concept? But when you talk about Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, where is your connection to Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz? Where is your connection to his political program? What can you quote, you know, from his actual speeches holistically that makes sense? And more importantly, if you're talking about this, alhamdulillah, what are you doing to advance an agenda of self-determination? What organization, what Jamaat, what are you doing to make us politically independent from the protection of disbelievers and from being subsumed under the rule of disbelievers or of white supremacy, you know? And I think that this is a really serious threat. And that's one of the reasons why I agreed to come on this thing, you know, because you were talking about, I think, and I agree with you, I think there's a need for everyone who is on La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah and is not on that, no matter what differences we may have, needs to at least, we need to have some type of unity. We can't be just off in our own corner standing alone.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Yeah, that you actually like came upon like a really, really critical point. And I think that's really one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this roundtable, because we did kind of recognize the unity, the need for unity within the struggle. And as people who are critical of kind of the larger American Muslim organizing spheres that's happening, a lot of like, just the appropriation of Malcolm X, the appropriation of Islam, of Blackness, just kind of continuously. We felt it was very important just to have you here. And I think I want to pose a question, I guess to any panelist here, because we just kind of stumbled upon it. But as people who are critical of the American Muslim civil society organizing, if people are, I think, committed Islamic and political organizers, what are steps should they take to combat this? So maybe the Amir, if you have any suggestions on this, being who you are, what would be your advice to young Islamic community organizers who want to organize really important direct action programs for their mosques, for their communities, but they're stifled by leadership that appropriates Malcolm X, that appropriates Islam and Blackness?
I think that you guys should keep doing what you're doing. I think that the young people should form their own independent organizations. It's not to cause any disunity or anything like that, but there's just certain things that the young people have to do that the older ones are either unwilling or unable to do, right? So these people who came over and to be here in America for the dunya, alhamdulillah, they have children. And I think the children of immigrants are very critical, because many times the children of immigrants identify with us as Black people, right? And so there's a connection that we have. So I think unless our young people form their own organizations, they're going to be just frustrated and they're going to be pessimistic. But when you form your own organizations like the Black Dharma Network or the Milestones Project and the Shahoods community, it's like when you have young people involved in their own structures and so on and so forth, then we're going to get somewhere. We're going to get somewhere because they're bringing a frame of mind that is designed to push us to the next level. I was saying the other day that that's the historical role of young people. They push us to the next level. Young people in the 60s, young people in the 80s, and young people, they're pushing us to another level. So I think that they have to be independent. They can still interact with the masjids, they can still interact and so on and so forth, of course, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time though, they've got to have structures that they themselves control. That's very, very critical. And I think that's happening, you know what I'm saying? And I think those type of groups are coming together. Today is an excellent example of that those type of groups are coming together. I'm glad to see how Milestones open up relations with the Black Dharma Network. And now the community that the chef who is involved in. This is very, very good to see, you know. So I would just encourage young people to keep on doing those types of things.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. And Bismillah, I would like to also respond to that too. Because I feel like that's a very crucial question that is sort of at the gate of us opening up a new era of activity, which is, young people have to be determined. Young people have to be determined. Do not let anyone discourage you. If you know that you're living in an unjust society, if you know that things are corrupt, if you know that you're witnessing constant oppression, don't be discouraged. Do not allow anyone in any of their knowledge to discourage you. Do not allow anyone's rhetoric or language or their organization or their position of authority or anything like that to discourage you. If you don't find support in the formations and groups and things that you're in, study, educate yourself, dig up this kind of information online. Look at research people who've tried to do the things that you want to do. You know, figure out the history and educate yourself as much as possible, because one of the things that's really fundamental to us really making a change is that every single individual is going to have to hold down their square. It's not going to be enough to be a member of a good group. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be enough to be a follower of a good leader. That will not be enough. Every single individual is going to have to hold down their square, is going to have to fortify themselves, is going to have to develop themselves, is going to have to grow, is going to have to strengthen themselves. And it starts with not being discouraged, because there's a lot of discouragement out there. And the state, the empire, okay, the shaitan is expert at finding ways to discourage you, is an expert at coming up with little traps and psychological pitfalls and different things to try to deter you, because they're fully aware they cannot stop you. The only way that they can stop you is to get you to stop yourself. So that means that we have to be driven. We have to be internally driven. And ultimately, it comes from Allah. You know, seek help and refuge from Allah, because it doesn't matter what's set against you. Allah can remove it, or can help you to overpower it, you know? And so I think, you know, for me, I've went through various political groups, consciousness phases, etc. And I've come up against all kinds of various forms of discouragement. And, you know, ultimately, if I had been willing to settle and accept any of those things, I wouldn't be involved right now. I'd probably be, I don't know, who knows? I mean, I'm scared to think about where I would be if I had let myself become discouraged. And I think that's essential. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different directions we can go. Like, once we got a clear head and we're really dealing with our strategy, and we're dealing with our manhaj of Islam, and when we're dealing with, you know, our traditions, there's a lot of directions we can go and apply ourselves, but all of it requires for us to be internally driven and strong and holding down our square as individuals. And so I would say, you know, that starts with, do not allow anyone or anything to discourage you from justice.
Can I say a couple of words real quick? Thank you, Hannibal and Imad. Your responses were really important for me to hear. One of the things that I would like to just add a little bit is that Dawah is really significant, but it has to be connected to jihad. And that's just something we just got to put on the table. So sometimes Dawah mechanisms, and none of us are doing that, Dawah mechanism sometimes is used by actually the integrationists as a way to not act. And they think the acting is only distributing a little bit of information. I'm not saying there's bad intentions. I'm not saying that. But structurally, there is a problem if we don't also do certain kinds of activity that is about struggle. And we saw Ferguson. We saw what happened with Mike Brown. We saw what happened to Trayvon. We have to understand what that means and what the rebellion that was happening. Now, Muslims are a minority in America, but we could be in certain roles where people actually have conversations and understand that we're embedded in those struggles, and then we can structure and direct those struggles if it's possible. We have to give that a try. And I think that's really significant, because if you look at the three models of organizations or organizing styles that Malcolm had after Hajj, there was three. People talk about two because those are the overground organizations. One is the Organization of Afro-American Community, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. One is about internally with Muslims working on moral reform, being strong, purifying the self within the Muslims. The second model was Malcolm was trying to connect in communities and strategies with outsiders to create a larger pressure point. And that was really important to fight against the American machine. It's not a simple machine, it's very complex. So we have to organize at that level too. We have to understand what that means. So the third organization, of which Malcolm was a political advisor for, was an organization named RAM, the Revolution Action Movement, which actually birthed the Panthers in many ways. So there's actually a direct legacy between Malcolm and Ram and Panthers, all of that. So what that group was doing was Muhammad Ahmed, Max Stanford at the time, came to Malcolm wanting to convert. Malcolm was still in the nation. He said, don't join. Do your own organization, because what you're saying is not allowed here. What you're saying is a disruption of the American machine. Organize as much as, and keep me as your political advisor. Malcolm was the international spokesperson for RAM. Everywhere he went, he actually talked about these youth. He actually talked about, hey, I got some young people who are on this other tip. And so that program was actually about agitation. That program was actually about a different kind of struggle. And so we have to understand that Malcolm is a complete picture, had different levels of struggle. But the thing that I have a problem with is when he's promoted by American Muslims as if the fact that he had multiple strategies, it was never a problem, multiple tactics. There was never any disagreement that he wanted the master's house to be on fire. That was never a conversation. That was never a debate with him and whoever. And he said, I have friends who are communist, capitalists. And he said, I even have friends, some of them are Uncle Toms. But he understood how to communicate. But he also understood that the fact that America as a project has to be dismantled. When we're saying anti-American stuff, it's about the project of America, right? So there are people, there are many people. And some of the things sometimes people who, because we talk about race a lot, me, Hannibal, Brother Hakeem, Imad even, and Amir Abdul Malik, sometimes I heard other people, when they hear us, I actually observe the commentary. Sometimes I hear, you're too race focused. What about, white this and white that? My question was never about a kind of weird empirical anti-whiteness. It was about white supremacy as a structure and as a structure that reproduces itself. I mean, my problem is, how come we don't have white Muslims like Muhammad Assad anymore? As many, you know what I'm saying? Like, how come we stuck with Hamza? How come, what's wrong? How come we don't have Hamid Algar? You see what I'm saying? Like, that's why that's my whole point. Become like that. So, there were people from the Weather Underground who were communicating. Those were whites. They wanted a disruption of American project. They were not happy with what they were inheriting. So, when we criticize, when we call into question whiteness, the kinds of, if there are Muslims who are understanding that, they need to understand that the project of stopping the reproduction of white supremacy is really significant. It's actually like an Islamic obligation, and it cannot change just by speaking. And so I think the three models of organizing that Malcolm kind of lays out, it has to be updated in today's society to a certain extent because we're at a different stage of history. But I think really we should really make sure we don't lose the connection between jihad and dawah. And that, for me, is very important.
Thank you guys so much for that. I think following off of that point, Hakeem, if you could just also explain the relevance of Malcolm X's critique of white liberals to the Muslim community today, kind of relating to this discussion we've been having as well about Malcolm being appropriated.
Sure. So Malcolm X, he had a critique where he indicated that let me bring up the exact quote that Malcolm X said, because I don't think I couldn't put it any other way. So Malcolm X, he said, the white conservatives aren't friends of the Negro either, but they at least don't hide it. They are like wolves. They show their teeth and they snarl that keeps the Negroes always aware of where he stands with them. But the white liberals are foxers who are always show their teeth to the Negro, but pretend they are smiling. The white liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives. They lure the Negro, and as the Negro runs from the growling wolf, he flees into the open jaws of the smiling fox. So this is Malcolm X's critique of white liberal politicians, of white Democrats, of white progressives, and is also equally applicable to the white left. Now, when you look at the American Muslim community of civil society organizations, they're so enamored by individuals such as Bernie Sanders. that Bernie Sanders, they're very laudatory of Bernie Sanders. They think Bernie Sanders is an anti-imperialistic figure. They think Bernie Sanders is going to stop the war against Islam. And they have all these high aspirations for Bernie Sanders, to the point where they're doing all of their organizing, and they're putting forth so much effort in support of Bernie Sanders. But when you actually analyze Bernie Sanders, his congressional record, what the man stands for, is very clear that he puts on this friendly face as though he's so cool with the Muslim Ummah, that he's so cool with the Black community, but his voting record says another story. So, for example, there was a bill passed, House Congressional Resolution 254, calling on the government of Cuba to extradite to the United States convicted felon Joanna Chesimard. Now, this is a slave name that the white power structure continues to call our sister Assata Shakur. And so the Congress, they passed the bill, or they passed a resolution to have our sister Assata Shakur, someone who struggled in the Black Liberation Army, someone who struggled in the Black Panther Party for the freedom of Black people, someone who loved Black people dearly, that she was willing to fight for our freedom, that she was willing to endure incarceration. And she was able to, by the help of Muslim brothers, be liberated from prison, and to be able to live in Cuba away from U.S. hegemony. Bernie Sanders voted for this bill to have our sister Assata Shakur extradited from Cuba in order to be placed back in an American jail cell and American prison system. And so when you think about the strong history, or what the liberation of Assata Shakur meant for the Black community, with the liberation of Assata Shakur, the fact that the brothers who did it, Brother Odinga, who were accused of it, that this is a testimony to the role of Islam in the Black liberation struggle. When you turn to Assata Shakur's autobiography, Assata Shakur herself actually said that the Islamic influence over the Black struggle has always been strong. Assata Shakur, she actually, when she was incarcerated, she actually litigated a lawsuit where she wanted access to Jumu'ah prayer services. And so this is Assata Shakur, and this is Bernie Sanders voting to have our sister extradited. When you look at Bernie Sanders' stance on reparations, the socioeconomic disparities between Blacks and whites are so large that even up into the year 2050, the Black people will still have less household wealth than white Americans. That the Black wealth is projected to be at 0 in the year 2050. And so Black families are struggling to have their basic needs met. Black families are struggling in poverty. And here Bernie Sanders is opposing reparations that Black people are rightfully owed. And so this man is no friend to Black people, yet American civil society organizations continue to support it. And I'm sure any of my other brothers and sisters on the colleague, if y'all want to expand on that, feel free to. Inshallah.
I mean, we had a whole session on Bernie, man.
Yeah. I was gonna say, if any of you guys would like to respond to that
argument. Thank you, Brother Hakeem. I appreciate that, man.
Excellent points, man. Excellent points.
Excellent points.
I really think that it really comes down to the liberal not really supporting self-determination for us.
Right.
Though the so-called conservatives don't support self-determination, the liberals don't support self-determination, the conservatives support American empire, the liberals support American empire, you know, and it gets back to what one of the brothers talked about, how realistic Malcolm was. America is an empire. America is an empire, and everybody in the world knows it except Americans. And so this empire, and I want to say too real quick, the justification for American empire is white supremacy. Right. White supremacy is the justification for American empire. And so Malcolm understood things as they were. And he said you had to see things as they are so that you'll come up with realistic solutions. You can't be an empire and a democracy too. You can't be an empire and a republic too. That's impossible. You know what I'm saying? And so Bernie was a part of that illusion. He was a part of that illusion that changes can come through the Democratic Party, revolutionary type changes, if you will, can come through the same party that's controlled by the same corporations, right? So the liberal is as Malcolm says, very dangerous. Just like in Quran, and I'll end with this, when you start reading the Quran, about 8-9 verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah has to talk about the hypocrites. Mm-hmm. He's got to talk about the hypocrites, right? Because the hypocrites were way more dangerous than the kuffar. The hypocrites were with us. You know, they were pretending, right? And so the liberal, as Malcolm would term them too, they're like hypocrites. That's really all they are.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think just like in liberal organizing as well, you find that, you know, this mantra like, oh, we're fighting for freedom, but they don't understand the distinction of freedom for some superficial representation versus a freedom of self-determination. So, I mean, they kind of put this the same way. I want to go to Tanzine, just kind of discussing more the relationship between American slavery and the war on terror. How do you think Malcolm X helps us to understand the connection of slavery, its history, and towards the war on terror?
Okay, that's a good point. Earlier that Imad was talking about something that really hit me was that, you know, if Malcolm was speaking today, what he would sound like. Well, you know, we had some people who were speaking like Malcolm, they got droned. Let me put it that way. And so there is a deep connection, as you can see, between the figure of Malcolm X, not just as how America looked at him as someone who should be in slavery, but it's also someone who wants to destroy the master's house. And which then American government would call that a terrorist today. So what would Malcolm X be today? He would be considered by the American Project as the boss of terrorists. That's what the American Project was look at him as. That's just something we need to understand. Like we were talking about facts and figures, right? So, and that's just a fact. So war on terror has a specific model of operation, which is about not just changing or targeting particular people who are the enemy combatants of the state, but it's also has millions being paid on institutions that wants to change the architecture of the religion of Islam. They can never do that because Islam, is all powerful. No one can do that. But America wants to do that. America wants to spend millions to create fake leaders, to create fake scholars who are going to say, oh, jihad is not really real, focus on the this and that and don't do. And if you try to do something, they're going to police your action from inside the community. Very important to understand this. Of course, we have to be intelligent. Malcolm also said, don't give your life unintelligently, right? So we have to be very careful that we understand comprehensively Malcolm's intelligence and his wisdom and his understanding and how that, and we have to channel that through Islam. And I think the way we have to connect these two projects, that the war on terror today wouldn't be possible without the earlier legacies of subjugation and the war on other figures that we had. And a lot of the times American Muslims, because of the way race is talked about in America, many Muslims who are non-Black, they don't know how to connect to Malcolm sometimes, particularly because of the way Islam is talked about, or Malcolm is talked about, or slavery even is only talked about in a racial way. So slavery is normally always talked about as a form of racial genocide, which is true. But one of the deep elements of genocide is that genocide is also always about cultural genocide, and by the definition of that includes religion. So one of the ways that slavery was a genocide, it was also a religious genocide. And that's why slavery was, by definition, an anti-Islamic project, the American slavery. So we have to understand, once we understand this, then it's like my brothers and sisters were enslaved by the white man. It's not just because there is a pigmentation issue. It's because my brothers and sisters, the level of theology were forcibly taken from their homes and made to worship someone else. And that's really important for us to understand. And so the way that the human subject is targeted, right, that wouldn't be possible unless without the legacy of slavery. And when we look at the war on terror today, the various the secret prisons, Guantanamo, all of those things, right? Just look at Frank Wilderson talks about it, like how the masters were forcing slave breeding, for example. You know, these are the kinds of brutality and violence that were like the earlier experiments that allowed for today's forms of brutality. So if we're really clear about these things, then we understand the connection between the figure of the slave and the figure of the terrorist is actually deeply connected structurally. So that's something that I just wanted to put out there.
Thank you so much. I want to get back to that as well. But before that, I want to turn to Ahmed and ask, considering this history and the discussion we've been having about the Muslim community and appropriating Malcolm X, what are your own views on Malcolm X's spiritual lessons?
We view Sheikh Malcolm, and this was something I asked some of my teachers and my Amir before going into this conversation with. I said, what is actually the proper way to refer to Sheikh Malcolm? You know, I say Sheikh Malcolm a lot because that's what my dad used to say when I was growing up. He would say Sheikh Malcolm, and just out of reverence, you know, and that he was our teacher and he was our elder. You know, he was also one of his most biggest titles. He was the Shaheed. You know, he was a martyr, and he was one of the first martyrs of Islam, you know, in these lands in our era. You know, of course, we have all of the martyrs, the shuhada from the slave uprisings and so on. But just, you know, from closer to our era, from the era that we're living in, you know, he was like the Shaheed, like capital S, you know, and his life, you know, his life, you know, there's no words for the way in which his life really testified and bore witness, you know, not to use too Christian sounding terminology here, but you know, his life was the shahada, you know, was testimony to this thing. You know, and another thing is, if you look in terms of what his actual position was, he was also an emir, you know, not in the empty sense, but, you know, just you know, a leader or a figurehead, and we're just calling him an emir, but in the sense that the Quran says, those in authority among you, obey Allah, obey the messengers, and obey those in authority among you. You know, and there was you know, he was the real legitimate Amir of the Muslims in this continent, you know, in that he was actually pushing for what Amirat is about, which is about self-determination and independence. You know, we also view him as a wali of Allah, you know, and sometimes people look twice when you say that, but look at the evidence of the character of what this man was like and what his spiritual station was. You know, we have more easier access, at least, and in some cases much more documented evidence of what was this man's spiritual station of him than we do, you know, of other people who were told are awliya, you know. And we have, you know, video evidence. You can look at the interviews with Ella Collins, look at how he took care of his family, the profound, you know, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, our Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the best of men is the one who's best to his family or best to his women, depending on the narration. Right. And one of the things Ella Collins said is he had this profound respect for womanhood. When he was traveling to different countries, he used to bring her plants from each country, and he would water the plant and keep the plant alive, even on the airplane, and somehow get it back to her. You know, this is his sister. And if you look at every stage of his life, and Aisha Prime, Sister Aisha Prime, Ustad Aisha Prime, excuse me, she mentioned this when we were at his graveside in a talk that she gave there, and I was there. And she said, you know, wali of Allah, one of the signs of wali is that Allah, it's as if Allah is taking care of every single aspect of their affair from the cradle to the grave, paraphrasing. And you see that he was guided at every stage, even without access to any Muslims to tell him anything, right? You see that he came in, you know, he had this 1 year or 2 years of being on the deen. And what did he do with those 2 years more than the rest of us do in 30 years, you know? And something that my Amir said when I asked him about that was, he said, our national Amir Mustafa said, the sign of a wali is their miraculous transformation of character and the ability to transform others. you know, exhibit A. And then another sign is the miracles. The people talk about the miracles of awliya and so on. But another sign is the miracles that occur after they're leaving this physical plane. The fact of how many people were and still are being inspired to take a path to Allah, and how this life is still resonating all over the earth among the revolutionary groups, among the oppressed, is proof of his wilaya with Allah. End of quote. You know, it says in the Quran in Surah Arad, Ayah 7, that for every people there is a guide. And our teachers tell us after, you know, that's the prophets. And then after the prophets, we have various awliya, we have various social reformers, revivers. And the brother of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, Sheikh Abdullahi Danfodio, said, for every single Musa, for every single Fir'aun, Allah will raise a Musa, alayhi salam. You know, and so I think that that's who he was for us. And the proof, you know, just kind of speaks for itself. You know, I mean, look at who he was. You know what I mean? Look at his character. And I can't cover that enough. And the last point I wanted to say was all of these men and women, you know, Isa alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Muhammad alayhi salam, Imam Malik, Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Imam Malik, all these people on down to, you know, Imam Abdul Qadir Khan, the Shehu, down to Malcolm. One of the things that characterized them is that they were not people who compromised on principles. You know, they were like Isa alayhi salam, turning over tables. You know what I mean? They were people who, and the sign of them, the Shehu said, I'm going to say two more things and end real quick. The Shehu said, the sign of these people, how do you know these people from the fakes? And he said, basically, and this is almost quoting, it's a close paraphrase, they will be opposed by everybody else among the leaders, basically, and they'll be the opposite of the leaders and the scholars of the time. And they'll be on the side, you'll always see them on the side of the oppressed and hated by the oppressors and seen as a threat. Whereas the other ulama will be always making excuses for the oppressors. And you'll just see them, even if you don't know the details of what they're saying, this is a way you can differentiate. Do you always see them always standing up, making some type of argument, even if the argument seems sound or logical to you? Are they always making arguments for the oppressor? Or are they always making arguments for the oppressed? And this, you know, this is how Sheikh Malcolm was. So when people say, who's the inheritors of, you know, when people like to talk about who are the inheritors of the prophets, ask them how much are they like Malcolm? Because he fit that description, that prophetic sunnah there, you know, like as my Amir said, like a tailored suit, you know. And so, you know, we want, may Allah give us the barakah and connection to Amir al-Hajj Malik Shabazz.
I mean, thank you so much, Ahmed, for the very illuminating summary on like Malcolm X and his spiritual lessons. I think just following that same trajectory, I want to ask Amir Abdul Malik if you could explain the significance of Malcolm X's transition to Orthodox Islam and how important him being a martyr was to the larger history as well.
Well, one of the things that was so critical to that is that, alhamdulillah, you know, man plans and Allah plans, and truly Allah is the best of plans. And so the FBI, as well as a corrupt element inside the Nation of Islam, wanted Malcolm kicked out of the Nation of Islam. They thought that was their plan, but that was actually Allah's plan. Because one of the things that happened with Malcolm is that, you know, down in the Southern Freedom Movement, the so-called civil rights movement in the South, it was extremely spiritual. One of the things I love about it, it was extremely spiritual. But when it shifted to the North, there was more of a militancy in the North, if you will. And Christianity in the North could not accommodate that type of militancy. By Malcolm coming to Islam, right, that gave the militants in the North a spiritual outlet that could accommodate their spirituality and their militancy, and that was Islam. So Malcolm brought a whole branch, if you will, of the Black liberation struggle to Islam. The people who were considered Black nationalists, the people who were considered just the more militant faction, if you will, right? But we're still an African people, and African people are very spiritual, right? And so by Malcolm coming to Islam, and as the brother talked about what Asata had said, the role of Islam in the movement, that was extremely critical, right? Best exemplified by when H. Rap Brown becomes a Muslim, right? And so that was very, very critical. So now we can have that militancy and we can have that morality. That's one of the mistakes that people made. They separated Malcolm's militancy from his morality. And so now with Islam and Malcolm coming to Islam, see, this is what's going to be really critical. I'll end with this. COINTELPRO was all about spreading corruption. It was corrupting everything. It corrupted the movies, it corrupted the music, it corrupted leaders, it corrupted organizations. COINTELPRO was all about corruption. That means the opposite of corruption is what this white man fears. And that's why the whole spiritual warrior is so critical. Malcolm, by coming to Islam, he was extremely active, right? A revolutionary, and at the same time, deeply, deeply spiritual. That was his foundation. So all of those things came together. And that's why Tariq Ramadan, Saeed Ramadan's son, we sat down with him some years back. He said that Malcolm told his father, Saeed, the reason why I'm going to be killed is because I know the true Islam. You know what I'm saying? Because it is this, Islam is posed to play a major role in the next phase of the struggle here in America, in the world, or in Islamic revival. So it's poised to play a major role in America. And at the core of that, we Malcolm.
Thank you so much, Amir, for that. That was very, very illuminating. I want to ask Hannibal. I think oftentimes when we speak about Malcolm X, we theorize a lot about what would he be doing if he was here today. So, like in your perspective and your experience, if someone like Malcolm X was here with us today, what are some of the projects he would be working on?
Thank you for that question. So, you know, I think this is something that it shouldn't be too hard for us to answer, merely because the circumstances and conditions have not changed at all. The only thing that's really changed is the way that we look at those circumstances and conditions. Whereas, you know, with the progress of time and the various political movements that have come and gone since then, the various ideologies that seek to determine the way people see things, we approach those things differently, we look at them differently, but ultimately the underlying conditions are the same. And so, you know, arguably, we would find him doing a lot of the same things that he did, you know. And so I have a few things which I would point out, like education. So as Muslims, we're taught that you know, in the Quran, there is guidance for people who think and reflect. Meaning, if you can't think and reflect, you're not going to get the benefit from it. You know what I mean? So the first prerequisite to that is building up a strong tradition of critical thinking and reflecting. Education, you know. Malcolm didn't just show up and give speeches. You know what I mean? Malcolm was actually heavily involved in teaching classes. You know what I mean? Classes was a fundamental part of the way that he was politicizing Black people, you know. And he was not just teaching propaganda or ideology or even just like you know, esoteric spirituality. He was teaching Black people their deen, right? So in Islam we call it deen. That means our way of life, and that's not a religious belief or a religious philosophy, but it's a holistic practice of life. It's a all-encompassing socio-economic political system. And that's what Malcolm was teaching the Black people. He was teaching it to them as it related to them, as it pertained to their lives, and providing for them spaces that they can engage with it, that they could study and learn, and actually benefit from it. And he recognized that, you know, that this was fundamental. So you often hear in his speeches, he's talking about the importance of studying to be able to make intelligent decisions. you know. And so I would say that would be like a fundamental part of his work, especially considering the level of ignorance that people are living in today. You know, where all of the information is available, yet we don't seem to be acting on it. We don't seem to be reflecting it. Yet you can just click a button and you can get so much information that's right there. But we seem to be acting less intelligent than when people had less access, right? So I would say, you know, I think he would be involved with educating people and with a general effort to build up a certain level of consciousness so that the general community has a certain level of consciousness that would allow them to act intelligently together, that will allow them to actually cooperate, and not just cooperate to benefit white supremacy, to benefit capitalism and the empire, but actually cooperate to benefit themselves, their people, their community, their children, and justice, etc., to actually benefit society in a good way and not merely contribute resources to a corrupt society. So I think that would be fundamental. I think he would be agitating, you know. Brother Tanzine talked earlier about agitation, and we find that for whatever reason, the Muslims today seem to be disinterested in agitation. And I struggle with that myself because it's so obviously clear in the Quran. It's so obviously clear in the life of Malcolm and other people that, you know, lived in a dignified way and acted in a dignified way. It's so obviously clear that agitation was a fundamental part of dawah, of building up the community. It was a way to rally people around their problems, to address their problems, and not merely go along every day existing in a state of dysfunction. You know, so he would be agitating, and I think he would be providing the spiritual, political framework for a very broad movement of agitation and struggle. And so I think, and what I mean by that more specifically is not simply, you know, marching on a sidewalk with a picket sign. What I mean is, you know, actually putting real pressure, actually, you know, like when we look at speeches he gave, like Message to the Grassroots, he talked about those people who were planning to shut down airports and things like that. That was the kind of agitation that he was constantly talking about, you know. And in those kind of conversations, you'll find in one breath he's talking about agitation, in the next breath he's talking about that old time religion. It was the same thing for him. It was directly connected. You know what I mean? When he talked about justice and he talked about the basis on which people should be agitating, et cetera, he would always go back to Islam. And so, you know, I think that that's something that we're really lacking. You know, I believe Brother Hakeem mentioned the white left earlier, and even if we're not looking at just the white left, but if we look at the traditions of the left today, we find that it's completely morally bankrupt. You know, that's why it was so easy for me to accept Islam coming from the left, because it was so obviously superior to the kind of corruption that existed in all of us, in all of our organizations, and all of our dealings. You know, it was so obviously superior in its ethics and its moral reform, which allowed for a strengthening of individuals, which allowed for a strengthening of communities, and which allowed for people to realize their full potential, you know, and their purpose in this life, in this earth. You know what I mean? And so I think that that basis right there, that moral spiritual basis that the left is lacking in, he would have been providing that for them. And then on the other hand, for the Muslims who are so docile, and I'm gonna have to get with Imad to learn that word so I can use it more intelligently.
That was good, man. That was
domesticated
ones, knowledge right there.
You know, the domesticated ones, man. You know what they're lacking is the agitation. And Malcolm was offering that to both of them. He was offering a platform of moral reform for the militants, and he was offering, and Amir was just talking about this too, you know. But I think that we would see that happening in a very robust way today, you know. And I think he would be really pressing the Muslims on that. You know, he'd be agitating, he would be challenging the big six. You know, we always find Malcolm challenging the sellouts. You know what I mean? So he would be challenging them. And what I mean by challenging them is that he would be giving us the receipts. People talk about receipts today. Malcolm will be running down all the receipts on all the foxes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because we got a bunch of foxes running around here today. You know what I'm saying? Like he said, we had a bunch of Uncle Toms. Well, we got a bunch of foxes running around in the Muslim community, right? And part of the problem is that people want to assume the best about their brother, which they should, right? But the other part of the problem with that is that, you know, people want to assume the best while turning their face away from the truth. People want to assume the best while turning their face away from corroborated knowledge, like Imad was talking about. You know what I mean? And that's ignorance. That's intentional ignorance, which is the opposite of Islam. You know what I mean? So that's a big problem. And he would be challenging them, and he would be challenging us to hold them accountable. You know, that's what I believe. And based on challenging them in that way, it would establish a platform for principled unity, because there's no such thing as unprincipled unity. That's the destruction of Islam. That's the destruction of our revolutionary programs. That's the destruction of our communities, is unprincipled unity. That means just going along to get along. That's not what we do. You know what I mean? So I think he would be challenging people, and by providing those challenges, it establishes a basis for principled unity. By having an honest conversation with one another, we can actually have an honest relationship. And then by having an honest relationship, we can strengthen it and make it indestructible, inshallah, you know. And finally, you know, the last point I want to make, which I think he would be doing, is, you know, he often talked about training soldiers. And I'm not a expert on any history from the NOI, but it's my understanding that he was heavily involved with the development of the Fruit of Islam. And we know that even after leaving the nation, he talked about training guerrilla units in the South, Black guerrilla units in the South, to respond to the KKK. He talked about, you know, training soldiers in the Congo. He talked about, he talked a lot about the need to train and establish a fighting force, you know, an actual fighting force that could actually respond when the governments ignore us, when they trample our rights, and we go to them peacefully and seeking out our rights and protection of our bodies and our properties, etc. You know, we're completely dismissed or ignored. And I think that, you know, he would be very involved with building up that capacity, you know, building up an actual military capacity, building up an actual capacity of self-defense, of protecting our communities, protecting our homes. You know, when we see some of the violence that's taking place, even since Trump has been elected, like we've seen a major ramping up of white violence against, you know, against Muslims, against Black people, against anyone they consider to be un-American. You know what I mean? They've become more and more violent, and I think that you know, he would be involved with checking them. You know, I think he would be involved with actually sending forces to put them in check, and in that respect, building our broader fighting spirit. You know what I mean? That we have to have a spirit of fighting because we're in a fight. You know what I mean? And I think that he really understood the value of that, and it wasn't just about some sense of, you know, trying to get back manhood, or trying to you know, be aggressive or trying to prove something. I think he had a real practical sense that it was actually necessary, that people are getting beat and killed, you know, raped and violated, locked up in prisons and what have you. And those people we're actually responsible for as people with a moral conscience, as people who actually know the truth. We actually do have an imperative responsibility towards those people. And I think he was one who, you know, had the courage to actually look that in the face and not shy away from it.
Thank you so much for that, Hannibal. It's very important. I want to turn to Hakeem and have him answer the same question about if Malcolm X was here today, what do you think he would be working on?
Yeah, so I want to elaborate on some of the excellent points that my brother Hannibal, as well as my brother Tanzine, made earlier. So Malcolm X, from the moment that Malcolm X had this amazing love for Dawah, this amazing love for informing other people about Islam, even when he was in prison, when he first got exposed to some aspects of the Nation of Islam, he had read in a book about how enslaved Africans were Muslim, how we came from Islamic cultures in West Africa. Malcolm X within that prison was going around telling other prisoners, hey, did you know that our ancestors in Africa, did you know that they were Muslim? Did you know about that in Africa they had these Islamic civilizations? He was doing this within the prison system. When he first got out of prison, one of the very first things that he did when he went to that Nation of Islam mosque, he went in there, he said that there weren't enough people there. He said, why are I have these teachings, but there's not enough people in this temple, as they called it then. And Malcolm X began going outside of that Nation of Islam temple and went up and down the streets of Detroit, talking to brothers who are selling drugs, talking to even women who are involved in prostitution, talking to brothers who are involved in gangs and other criminal elements of society. And he was openly talking to them and inviting them to this Nation of Islam temple. And this is like, this was the first thing that he had when he got out of prison, one of the very first things that he did. And when you read his autobiography, when he first went into that Nation of Islam temple, he told the then whoever was the minister at that particular temple, he was like, hey, there aren't enough people here. And he had this hunger that he wanted other people here. And he said, when the Black community is suffering from drugs, when there's so much infighting and we have all these social ills, that this shouldn't be empty. And when you read the last interview of his life, Malcolm X, he says that, he points to his role in developing the infrastructure of the Nation of Islam. And then he raises a rhetorical question saying, how easy is it for me, since I was able to do this, to spread the teachings of true Islam? And so this was on Malcolm X's agenda. And I wanted to further elaborate on something that Brother Tanzine said when he spoke about the connection between the war on Islam, the slave plantations. Mm-hmm. So as Muslims, I think one thing that Malcolm X really taught and that he really hit home in is white supremacy and its impact upon the Muslim Ummah. And Brother Tanzine, he cited examples that were present within slavery and the slave plantation. So there were explicit laws in place that mandated that African enslaved Africans be Christian, that they had to be Christian, that they be forcibly Christianized. That was the agenda of white slave owners in the United States, that they had to be forcibly Christianized. This is why when you read slave narratives, there's a slave narrative from Abu Bakr written by an enslaved African named Abu Bakr, where he's lamenting the fact and almost pleading with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Islam may not survive in his family due to all of this horror taking place on the slave plantation. And he's pleading with Allah that Islam remain in his family. And so it was white supremacy that interfered and interrupted the ability of enslaved Africans to transgenerationally transmit Islamic knowledge from one generation to the next. You could not, on the slave plantation, study tajweed, recitation of the Quran, study sciences of hadith, or any sciences of Islam under the horror of the slave plantation. When you read the slave narrative of Omar ibn Said, where he's saying that he forgot a lot of the Quran that he had memorized, and that he may have he has a lot of mistakes in terms of his Arabic grammar. And he says that he's been on the plantation for so long that it interfered with his ability to study Islam and to have the excellence that when it came to utilizing Arabic grammar. He's sad about this fact. And there are a couple of mistakes present when he reproduces some aspects of the Quran. When he quotes the Quran, there's some mistakes that he attributes to his inability to really refine his Quranic studies while on his slave plantation. But it's also a testimony to the fact of the strength of Islam. The fact that not just in Omar ibn Said's case, it was another brother, Diallo, who even after enduring the horror of the Middle Passage, even after the mental trauma, enduring the mental trauma associated with being in a slave plantation, being in the bottom of a boat and crushed like sardines in a can, these brothers still had the intellectual capacity to reproduce entire copies of the Quran purely from memory. They found copies of the Quran in Jamaica, copies of the Quran in Bahia, copies of the Quran throughout the United States that were reproduced purely from their memory, which is a testimony to the strong Islamic educational institutions that existed within West Africa. And so even in parts of Haiti, when there were enslaved Africans who established their own maroon societies within Haiti, and the French colonials, they established, or they launched an all-out attack and all-out war on these maroon societies. And on some of their corpse, they actually found Quranic ayahs. They found copies of Quranic passages on these enslaved Africans who have been murdered by these white defenders of slavery. There's another example in Bahia, Brazil, where they actually said that in lead up to that slave rebellion in Bahia, Brazil, that there were people who were mass converting to Islam, that they were coming into Islam, that even adherence to indigenous African religions, a lot of those religions were tribal, that it wasn't universal. And so they have documented that people were learning Al-Fatiha, that they were making mistakes in their Al-Fatiha, but there's this process of learning more about Islam among African people in lead up to the Bahia slave rebellion. And so understanding the role that white supremacy has had on African people, on the Muslim Ummah, is very, very important. And it is something that we should be cognizant of. And Malcolm X, he was able to establish credibility to even give the dawah that he was by being a vocal critic of white supremacy. He wasn't nowadays we have imams who are trying to downplay the violence that Black people face at the hands of police departments. Malcolm X first became famous. He first became a national, prominent figure in the Black community after the police had went into a Nation of Islam mosque and brutalized one of the individual brothers in the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm X organized an entire contingent of the Nation of Islam's Fruit of Islam to organize against this act of police brutality. This is how Malcolm X became so wide respected within the African American community. It was his ability to critique white supremacy, and this gave him the social capital and the credibility to give the type of dawah that he was doing. So Malcolm X, his focus, if he was still among us, he would be further educating Black Americans about their Islamic heritage in Africa. The brother earlier, he spoke about the Uthman Dan Fodio, the Sokoto Caliphate, the fact that in the commitment to Black excellence, that this is what Malcolm X literally embodied to the Black community, the importance of Black excellence. And parts of the Sokoto Caliphate, for example, they were studying Euclidean geometry. Europeans thought to instill this idea that we were savages, we were just running around on trees, when in actuality there's primary source evidence that when Europeans went into aspects of the Sokoto Caliphate, Sultan Muhammad Bello, that they had entire texts of Euclidean geometry that they were studying. In Timbuktu, they had a heliocentric conception of the universe prior to even Galileo. And so Malcolm X would be refocusing and educating Black Americans about their Islamic heritage in Africa, and continuing to do what he was doing, critiquing white supremacy.
Thank you so much, Hakeem, for that. And thank you guys all so much for your contributions. We're at the end of the program, but I want to give you guys all the option to say one last word. Starting with Tanzeen.
Yeah, can I quickly say something about
Yes.
just to add on to stuff that Hakeem and Hannibal and Imad and Amir was saying. The question, because we brought up the question of crisis to an extent, and the question of urbanization. We're noticing now in America, when forgetting all these figures of Bernie and Trump or whatever, but the constituencies, what they're fighting for right now, we're seeing a crisis, an economic crisis. It's been going on for a few decades, but the most recent problem of the crisis is related to this health crisis that's happening with the coronavirus and the pandemic and the lockdown. All these protesters who went, the right-wing protesters and so on, to open the economy, right? It's actually not just simply about race hatred and things like that. What we're seeing is a kind of economic crisis. When Trump was elected, his job was to create a boom, but he encountered problems, right? So that's why he had to cut deals overseas, and he had to cut down on the wars and things like that, because he knew that Americans, including the white poor, they voted him because they wanted a boom in the economy. And now these protests are about having that boom, right? So what we're noticing is in America, the actual economic issue is how to manage a zero growth economy. That's what we're faced with. We're entered a terminal crisis. So the zero growth economy, this whole burning stuff is all about that debate. Who can manage a zero growth economy? Trump wanted what he called an economic nationalism. If you actually read this alt-right text, they're not talking directly about race. Some of them do, the completely uncouth ones. But there are the ones who are thinking about this right-wing ideology, they're thinking about economic nationalism. And that nationalism was based on an economic patriotism. And that economic patriotism was connected to the war on terror, managing the Chinese economy, managing the Islamic world through various forms of direct control and so on. One of the things that's really important about the Malcolm X as a figure is his perspective on urbanization. So when the Amir talked about the North, right, we're talking about the cities, we're talking about inner cities, and Hakeem talked about that. One of the things that's going to be really significant coming up for all of us to kind of, I think, important to pay attention to, whenever there's a deep economic crisis, and there's not gonna be a deeper one, it's a fertile ground for fighters. It's fertile ground for soldiers, what Hannibal talked about. So this organizing, because there's gonna be unemployment, there's gonna be a lot of frustration, there's gonna be a lot of problems with that. So we're going to see that. So this whole zero growth economy, the American government won't, regardless of who comes, it will be a very hard to actually have a management. Americans are not going to accept a zero growth economy because they want their boom, right? So, so that's going to create a major problem. And one of the things about urbanization is that under a regular boom, what cities are organized as cities where capitalists can invest in. They're made, so a city, that's what gentrification is. It's not only about the values and the culture, it's actually removing people who live there so that there's capital investment and the property values go up and things like that. So when that's not possible, what we're talking about now, for those of us located in different cities, is we have to think about how do we have cities in which we construct cities where people can live in, not where people can invest in. Those are two different things. So that's the whole structure of economic crisis that I think we're going to encounter. And the whole Dharma Network, the beautiful work that Hakeem does with his organization is going to be even more relevant because we're going to be seeing more people frustrated, dispossessed, attacked. The police violence is only going to increase because urban youth are going to be really frustrated. Inner cities is going to be really frustrated about all of that. And that's where really an opportunity for Islam. That's a great opportunity for us to actually be there when these things actually happen, right? So you have to understand that. That's my last point, inshallah.
Thank you for that. Amir Abdul Malik, do you have any last words?
We're witnessing the death of an empire. America's a falling empire. In the Quran, Allah talks about how He will either snatch a social unit all at once, or through a process of gradually wasting away. So it seems like the one-time Soviet Union fits the former example, like just snatched away. And then the gradual wasting away seems to apply to America. The empire is dying. And now we find ourselves in this age of what one writer called the age of radical evil. But it's no coincidence that while we're in the age of radical evil, there's an Islamic revival. Those are no coincidence at all, right? And so I think, as again, what was said, the whole, getting back to the whole thing of African uprisings led by Muslims, right? There's a history there. African uprisings led by Muslim. Malcolm represented that. African uprising led by Muslim. We have to go back to that tradition. We have to figure out a way of how we can inject ourselves more into with the liberation of our people. You know what I'm saying? And we have to come up with some specific things. What's happening now, as I said earlier, what's being done is very heartening. So it was just an honor to be with you all today. Just really an honor. And I'm even more optimistic for the future when I see young brothers and sisters like yourselves doing what you're doing. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much, Amir, for that. Ahmed, do you have any last words?
I wanted to say, I think that, and this also is in terms of, I think we should be doing what, I'm not sure what Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz would be doing. And my last words would be what I think we should be doing. And it's, well, I should say, I'm not sure what he would be doing in terms of that, his big focus was the OAAU. And I've asked myself this question a lot. How is a formation, a kind of political program like what he had going with, he had the Muslim Mosque Inc. and then the OAAU here, and it's important how those two are working together. The OAAU aspect of it, I don't know how that's possible with the incredibly degenerate, weak left and weak liberal presence that we have. Like, how do we work with people like that? Like back then it was possible to work with them. Is it now? I don't know. What I'm certain that Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz has done, and what I think we should focus on, the words I would close with, is I think that we need to be focusing on group structure and discipline that makes it possible for us to act not as individuals, but as Jamaat, to be awliya, protectors of each other, as the Quran says, and to not need, I can't emphasize enough, we have to provide the means, and we've all failed. Our community and our Jamaat, and I individually, have failed in this, and every other community, all of us have failed historically. We have to deal with this. We failed to provide the means for people to enter Islam and be able to turn away from taking disbelievers, in this case, white supremacy, as their protectors and their awliya and their friends. We can say that ideologically and rhetorically, but when people have, I know this is a lot of what's caused our organizations to break down. If you are inside those Jamaats and inside those movements, a lot of what really destroyed it, it's COINTELPRO and all these other things, but also it's just that fact. When it comes down to when people have divorces, when people have child abuse, domestic violence, there isn't a structure that's strong enough when there's drug dealing right there across the street from where you're trying to worship and raise your kids, or when there's pimping and prostitution and all these things. And domestic issues is a lot of it. I can't overstate enough how that is actually what makes that kind of corruption destroys our potential to make movements. So it's not even like we can't even get to the point of having these movements that we need if we're not addressing that. I think Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz would definitely be addressing those points in terms of what Hannibal was saying. There has to be, we have to have basic security, shall I say, martial efficacy. We have to have group structure and discipline. And I'll end on saying, if you go to the Masjid of Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem, who are some of the successors of Sheikh Malcolm and directly connected to him, it's very, very structured there to this day. A lot of the political stuff is not so much what strikes you when you first come into it, but it's very structured, it's very security conscious. And their Imam Talib, he said to one of my uncles, he said that in his whole time, and he was one of the, the young, he was around when Malcolm was around. He said, the biggest or the central conflict in the Muslim community in this continent has been between two groups of people, between the people who believe in Jama'ah as part of Islam and the people who want to take that concept out of it. And my uncle said he never thought of it. We think of it in terms of, okay, immigrants versus indigenous, or African-American or whatever. We think of it in terms of political and the not political, whatever. So I think we need some type of Jamaat. It doesn't have to be our Jamaat. Everyone's not going to join one Jamaat. That's not going to happen. Just let that go, right? Well, we need to have numerous different Jamaats. If you're going to be with this community, try to just make that community more cohesive. If your community is so corrupt that you can't do it, start your own, whatever. But we need to start moving in group structure and not as individuals, and develop the discipline and the structure so that we can stop taking disbelievers as our protectors. And we can offer people, when we do the da'wah, we can offer people, you can enter a community where we will actually take care of your needs, where we will be the law enforcement. There will be no need for that law enforcement. And the last point, I'm trying to make this very brief, and I'm sorry. Just because I wanted to clarify, I don't want to misrepresent the Jamaat. Our position is actually not, we don't take the opinion that it's permissible to be in these lands giving da'wah. We take the opinion it's permissible to be in these lands because we're giving da'wah, and we are actively working to establish communities which are self-determining politically, economically, and socially, where we don't have to turn to these people for that right here. And if we don't believe that, we have to make hijrah. Our sheikh himself made hijrah, is often trying to get us to go to Africa with him. So, but it's a matter of niyyah. Like, what is your niyyah, right? If you don't think that it's possible, and I've told myself and told my family, if we come to a point where I'm like, I can no longer look myself in the mirror and say that we can really build Islamic self-determination here ever, then it's obligatory on us to make hijrah, not because I want to, because we have to, And so that is our position. I just didn't want to misstate, since I had said that earlier, I respect that position that people take, but that's our position. We're trying to establish Islam in its fullness here. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, for that. That was just very, very illuminating as well. Hannibal, do you have any last words?
Yes. So I want to give an acknowledgement. Imad was the brother that gave dawah to me. At the time I was like self-identified anarchist. And I met this brother in the streets. We met on the front lines, you know what I mean? We were dodging billy clubs together and that kind of thing, and he was someone who allowed me to ask him anything I needed to ask about Islam and establish a personal relationship and understanding. And I really appreciate that. After that, I soon after that met Tanzeen, who became like a big brother to me. And the two of them, I would say, like, when I was sick, probably gave me the most support of anyone in my life. It was the Muslims who stepped up because I had cancer for 5 years. It was fundamental for me, and it was like I just want to give them some acknowledgement. And Brother Amir Abdul Malik, who's become almost like a second father to me, and who's also become like someone who's always made himself available to teach me personally, to answer my questions, visit me in the hospital. I can't overstate how important those things have been to me. So I want to acknowledge those brothers. And also Hakeem, I feel the work he's doing is essential to our success and our growth in the future. And so I just want to emphasize those brothers. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair for that, Hannibal. That was just very, very beautiful to hear. Hakeem, do you have any last words?
Yeah, so thank you, Sister Isra, for inviting me on this program.
Thank you.
Brother Tanzeen, all the other panelists, it was great learning from you all and your experiences. To the Amir, to Brother Imad, and Brother Hannibal, it was great learning and listening from all of you all. So one of what I wanted to leave off with was the importance of Dawah in the African-American community and the urgency of Dawah. I've worked with different brothers in prison who are incarcerated, who have come to Islam in prison, and a lot of them, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I've encountered brothers who are incarcerated, who are in prison, and have come to Islam in prison, and they say things like, "Oh, I wish I would have heard about Islam before, my situation. I wish I would have heard about Islam before." Structures like the school to prison pipeline or are very, very real in the Black community. Structures such as where poverty exists, there's a rise of the drug economy as a way for people to have, basic necessities that they see everyone else has. These things are very real in the community, in the hood, in the inner city. And as Muslims, we need to be interjecting ourselves in these environments and giving the call to Islam. When I was in me and some other good Muslim brothers in Chicago, we were in the Gardens Housing Project, which is a housing project in Chicago that has an annual income of where the average resident has an average annual income of less than $10,000 a year. And this is extreme poverty. And the way that white city planners built this community is they put it right near toxic waste dumps. So there's a larger amount of health problems, asthma, cancer, and other rare diseases as a result of being placed strategically under and this is something that Malcolm X taught us about, where he said that these civil rights legislation that they passed wouldn't really do anything to eviscerate structural racism in American society. Prior to the civil rights legislation, they passed the Chicago Neighborhood Composition Act to intentionally put Black communities near toxic waste dumps, garbage incinerators. Civil rights legislation passed, there's still people living there. And so we were in this housing projects, and we were talking to some brothers on the block, and we went there with some Qurans and some autobiographies of Malcolm X. And I was talking to one of the brothers on the block about just starting up a conversation, and I showed him this autobiography of Malcolm X. And he was like, "Oh, I learned about Malcolm X when I was in school." And I talked to him a little bit about Malcolm X. And then I showed him the Quran. I said, it was this Quran that in the message in this Quran that transformed the life of Malcolm X. And the way that I saw these young Black teenagers just looking at that Quran, just based upon hearing about Malcolm X, the way that they were just looking at the Quran, I could just tell that they just wanted to be a Muslim. They wanted to learn more about Islam. So Brother Tanzine, you can elaborate further upon this, but we have a forthcoming fundraiser where we're going to be utilizing to organize more Dawah initiatives, particularly in inner city Black communities that have been disproportionately impacted by structural racism, by white supremacy. So we can try to organize our efforts to continue this Islamic agenda of Malcolm X. So it's going to be a joint collaboration between Milestones and Black Dharma Network. And we would appreciate it if anyone would be able to donate to these efforts. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Hakeem, for those words, and for all of the panelists for you guys' beautiful contributions. This roundtable, this conversation came about a sentiment of recognizing the need for unity and struggle. So we hope that this collaborative roundtable between Black Dharma Network, the Jamaat, Sheikh Uthman Dan Fadio, even the Oakland Islamic Community Center is really just the first step for hopefully, inshallah, a long future of upcoming collaborative projects and everything. So Jazakallah khair for all the viewers who've been watching here today. We hope you guys learn from this. And if you guys are interested in communicating with us or reaching out to us or organizing, helping in any sort of way, please don't hesitate. And assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.